Hello everyone, today we talk about Illyrian tactics between the 4th and the 2nd century BC. I surely will make something else for the prequel or in the sequel of this chronology. Of course, there is not much on the horizon in terms of how Illyrian warfare developed in a particularly structural or really transfiguring way from a center to another. They're long history, as a matter of fact. There would be, right? But the differences sometimes are so scarcely documentable in the first place that we remain just with the most, say, concrete, also material evidence of people that, as the ones of sedentary Europe, fought pretty much in the same way. It is true that the Illyrians were also one of the least developed people in this picture, meaning at least the Celts in their broader territorial extension. They would leave more evidence, would have in some areas some greater military development, naturally in parallel with the political and social one, even though also in that case it doesn't really make much sense in the first place trying to differentiate it too much. Like, I don't know, the central southern Gauls didn't fight in a radically different way even from the more underdeveloped Britons or from the Galatians or the Boii in Central Europe, or whatever, right? So with the Illyrians we have a smaller space, also characterized by, as you know, pretty orographically harsh terrain, lots of mountains, which prevented, there is not even a major fluvial basin that allows the Illyrian civilization to thrive at levels as other cultures managed to do, also for different, say, connections, proximities, even the Thracians, but the neighboring Celts in Singidunum. We've seen it with the video about the Skordiski, and even compared to, for example, part of the Illyrian offspring in Italy, right? The Apulians had, for example, some Illyrian blood, but they also developed their military fundamentally along the patterns of the rest of the what were fundamentally Italic populations. We do see some trace here and there. We will see it, if anything, when looking at some of the Apulian tribes' arms and armor. But the concept that I always leave you, I'll usually leave you with when talking about this broader, again, continental European population, is that they did really fight in pretty similar ways. The way they differed is the degree by which, I don't know, they could foster a more or less cohesive heavier cavalry, for example, and employing. It's not that they all had the same arms, just on the basis of their, I don't know, per capita wealth or their, again, different political connections, the types of enemies they had to face, etc. And we can't isolate individually these factors and say, well, quantitatively, in absolute terms, this is the deal right here. We just are left with this, again, broader picture, which also gets down pretty much in the first look, like without too many surprises or hidden, let's say, dynamics in the essence of this population. But the most important thing, of course, has always been politics, right? A people is the strongest, militarily speaking, if it is politically cohesive, right? It's not, let's say, political cohesion there is not measured in just an absolute standard, but how much opposition can put realistically to an enemy, right? And the Illyrians are actually, in many ways, pretty warlike. As you know, the Romans, just at the time of the Teutoburg force, was actually in part a consequence of that, rebelled, in part, obliging the Romans to mobilize an incredibly large amount of soldiers. Some sources say nobody had ever seen that since the Second Punic War. This is not actually realistic, also because during the Roman civil wars many more troops had being mobilized, but the general sense that the Great Illyrian Revolt was a big deal, and that the Romans had to spend their adequate amount of time putting it down, as it had created severe strategic issues, doesn't mean, as always, that this people was particularly developed or militarily effective as a whole. It's just like, I don't know, the same battle of the Teutoburg Forest, or in the broader picture, Rome had an hegemonic position that could not be an inch at that point in history, and that fundamentally was being tested by actually pretty desperate moves that really corresponded to the degree by which these peoples knew that they would have gone under Rome without any chance of making it, if not by risking everything in this desperate attempts. But that also shows you definitely how fiercely people can fight. Today, actually, we do not talk about that, because I will talk about the Great Illyrian Revolt in a bit. About I will make some regional series about the Illyrians as well, because the political and military history is often more effective for the aforementioned spotting the aforementioned indicators than even a tactical history. But to be complete, right, how did the Illyrian armies fight, I think, is an important question to answer. Today we just introduce it. I, as you know, don't go usually too much beyond this for each Hellenistic era people, if not for armies, organizations, battles, arms and armor. But of course it would be interesting to expand on themes like tactics in a more specific, critical, articulated way. So the Illyrians were famous in the ancient world for being a sort of an amphibious, warlike people, right? Not in the sense that, of course, most of their warfare wasn't actually terrestrial and continental, but of course their piracy in the Adriatic, in the Ionian Seas, and even beyond, was something that, if you look at the history of the Balkans, it would remain pretty much in there, right? We've seen it also recently for the High Middle Ages, for the Croats, for the Serbs, in the same areas, right? But in the ancient world, this was somehow characterizing the Illyrians, because this sort of more closed sea space was used in the same fashion, but people was considered pretty unitarily as a nation, right? So in the Latin sense, right, not eventually the other populations that you can see still in the modern Balkans, for which they were in fact Balkanized, but as actually a pretty large people, as a matter of fact, right? Say half of the Balkans was fundamentally Illyrian in nature, and the extent of this population, also ethnographically speaking, is debatable. There are some populations inhabiting in Pannonia and in neighboring land towards the south that we do not know whether they were Illyrian or Celtic, or in fact also mixed with other elements. This is not too important, at least, as you know, if you make a video on the internet about this for contemporary reasons that I'm not going to digress on, but that, believe me, make a lot of views and a lot of money just without saying nothing else, because they attract like bees and honey, for not saying something else. But as a whole, this of course meant an important degree of sort of historical variety, some continuity in Roman times with much older ancestral traditions that all these peoples shared in one another. There has been some interesting archaeological find in some Romano-Illyrian grave, as a matter of fact, of an entire war chariot buried. We're talking early imperial times, or maybe even slightly later, something like the 3rd century. I don't remember honestly. It's recent discovered some couple of years ago. That really tells you in many ways how much, of course, these peoples were similar historically. Just before I was citing just a bunch of, I don't know, the Illyrian presence in southern Italy, also the contested frontier, like how much influence is there on the Illyrians from, for example, the same Altstadt culture, how this also affected divinity. These are all populations we will see at some point, because it's interesting to at least show how, in spite of the obsessive differences that emerged just in the last couple of hundred of years for post traditionally Catholic imperial beliefs, peoples had to differ, and you had just to concentrate of the differences, etc. Of course, these populations believe the exact opposite of the same. They believe that they had all to come back to the one, and they look at their differences as a shame, as a matter of fact, meaning that the different degree by which they had fallen, and only the greatest power of all would have, in fact, had the transfiguring capacity of putting this humanity on a very different footing, which is, in fact, what the Romans took enormous pride of in the first place. The Illyrians were also, again, they were an ancient people in a general sense, in the way they also ethnically diversified. This is not what we're going to discuss it, but they were also loose overall. There wasn't, like for most nations at the time, like a great sense of their own political unity or need of the self-capacity in the first place. You always find still, if you go when times of forums, right, where people still spent their time there, like all this, tragically frustrated statements like, I don't know, if the Celts had united, they could have defeated Rome. They just didn't do that because, and of course they don't explain that, because the question is either one, you're cultural underdeveloped, secondly, you're too peaceful or meek or whatever, which is actually what all these cultures were constitutively and essentially the opposite of by universal standard. So what I always say is that what ifs are for losers in the first place. Like the real men care about real history, right, and what happened in reality to analyze, because here we're not talking a bunch of, I don't know, of rabbits watching, remaining passive in front of one of them being eaten alive by a stoat and saying, oh, phew, that's not me this time. We're talking about politics. We're talking about large masses of people, of, organized forces, and things do not really work in the same way. Illyrian warfare reveal the rather, of course, warlike, but also unpredictable character of this population, right? A nation of fighters both on land and sea. In other words, they were all fragmented. As such, they were generally unpredictable. They were mostly about raiding, and they had this sort of sea bias, at least those who lived on the coast, because the Greeks, the Romans eventually had to cope with the Illyrian piracy at a point or another, and the possibility of reducing them simply to obedience was for a long time just useless, right? It was enough, after all, to control the coast and at the main centers, fortifying there and leaving the hinterland to these more savage people, fundamentally. And just later on, when Rome especially took on this properly continental character of its imperial expansion essentially from the 1st century BC, but the Romans had already occupied important parts of Illyria gradually, right? Just because of needs of pacification, of course, the Illyrians were to be finally subjected, and they were not in the condition, as we were saying before, to make more than general show-offs, but unavoidably losing and paying actually quite violently for especially the rebellion against Rome, right? The hand had to call back. In fact, the conquest of the Boiaenum, the actual part of, if it was considered so, of Germania that actually interested the Romans, to send, in fact, the best generals of their time, including Tiberius, for example, to repress systematically the Illyrian rebellion. It took years to be put down, because, as you know, also the Balkan hinterland is one of the most traumatically nightmarish places you can ever think to fight a war, right? This is true actually for all the southern European peninsulas, from the Iberian to the Italian one, but you can't really pick one. If I had to pick, probably would be the Balkans, but I'm not entirely sure, like, who has the palm of the most terrifying place to ever have to fight a war in. In any case, the Illyrians were described also tactically in ways that make a lot of sense along this generally scarce level of cohesion at a political level between the chiefs. What I said very often for the Celts, for example, made at this point an important amount of Celtic warfare content is generally valid for these populations as well, right? They did not have sort of permanent national military organization. They did not have, like, in fact, Illyrian-wide infrastructure to be funded or to levy troops to confer them like a higher training or cohesion. They mostly were an alliance, right, of different groups, different tribes, different centers that fundamentally went at war for common reasons of keeping mostly more advanced civilizations out and employing their simple and sometimes effective means, also the only ones they really had, in order to create those conditions of asymmetry for striking the enemy, like as all war is fundamentally about, right? For example, the Illyrians were described to charge rashly into situations they couldn't really get out of in any sensible way. For example, at the Roman siege of Scodra in 168 BC, the defending Illyrians sallied out of their actually strongly fortified position and, quote, on a level ground joined battle with greater spirit than they were able to maintain. Essentially, they decided that it would have been better, for whichever reason that is, strategical here, rather than evidently exploiting any tactical advantage, which may have even been a correct assessment, meaning if we have eventually to be taken anyway, let's try this at the beginning, but predictably they were soundly beaten. So what happened was that, according to the source, naturally, that is, you see, that's what, like with ancient history, it's just, as we'll see now, even too easily simple to judge this performance. Like, we just rely on this, but what if there was a general contempt towards the Illyrians? That they don't like this kind of thinking. There is, in fact, no sort of conspiracy theory against peoples having existed, having been strong or whatever, like inexplicably, and just mostly for ancient history, people seem to, at least in this time in history, being obsessed with for some inferiority complex, as it is actually demonstrated, as we'll see later, by important acts of not just valor but also military quality. In this case, instead, however, the situation is worse. The phrase meaning simply that they said, okay, we can't crush them, at first attack, we can maybe exploit surprise, but this initial impetus, which is really typical of barbarian peoples, as they basically in fact don't have the means to sustain this for much longer, even just from a logistical point of view, or because they're even at a very strictly tactical level, they aren't orderly enough. They're not trained, as we will see now, on a regular basis to really care about the general order of the formation or whatever. They exhaust themselves quickly, or at least the potential that they had for doing something, and they are severely beaten by the Romans. Of course, the myth that the barbarians went at war without order or whatever is completely false. Like, all these peoples, of course, had a pretty solid understanding of what like a battle line was, how what close order worked like, etc. But the degrees by which this could be achieved and maintained are different from people to people. And of course, here we see that the Illyrians did not have the same level of, for example, training and general discipline of the Romans at a collective, but also at an individual level, right? Surely an Illyrian warrior, like, say, let's not exaggerate in the terms of elite, right? What we see in the broader barbarian world is, like, many people think at least that it's just every single person is a sort of systematic killer, great warrior that lives just out of combat. But no, right? Just a very narrow part of the population did, right? The others were more or less violently habituated peoples that absolutely knew how to cut a throat and steal cattle, and had witnessed rape, violence of any kind, mostly participating or suffering from raiding warfare, which was endemic, right, systemic, right, but that at best makes you sort of militiaman, some that can be levied every once in a while, that would preferably keep staying at home in his farm, whatever. There were also very primitive peoples, say, among the very primitive groups and tribes within the Illyrians, especially the ones on the Dinaric Alps. We're talking here the 4th to 2nd century BC in general, also across Europe, severe levels of primitiveness, of underdevelopment. But again, the general idea, both for a mountaineer that would join into the raids along the valleys, etc., or some guy living in a proto-urban reality on the Adriatic coast and joining regularly into like raids also at sea, etc. But they would have an idea of what, say, order, alignment, that their chiefs would know how to, of course, make sensible decisions and keeping these guys together. Again, large Illyrian forces today, we do not talk about the army's organization, but they were somewhat rare. When they were gathered, they were also pretty heterogeneous, meaning that they were mostly strangers to one another. You have to rely on, like, sometimes these are groups of even few tens of peoples that are put in battle. Think about the necessary cohesion and collective drill for cavalry effectiveness. Like, these guys would put together just on the spot, unless they had some progressed habit to fight together with people that they knew, which was somehow rare in the broader engagements. They were not able to perform at that scale of combat very well. In fact, we will see that the Illyrians, in their primitiveness, were mostly about just heavy infantry of some sort, right? When I say heavy infantry, is the one that can hold the line, right? Not heavy in the sense of the different upgrades of armor that you see in video games. Like, light means just the skirmishers that go at war in loose formation, that can't hold the ground against what is in relative terms to this heavy infantry. And then they had also a few cavalry, and also pretty light one, which tells you that wasn't much surplus out there in the first place. I think I made a video about Illyrian armor. Is one of, excuse me, I'm gonna check now. One of the very first I made on Schwerpunkt, I think I remember, or even Illyrian helmets. Yes, I think that it was. No, helmet and armor. Okay, I did something on the Thracians as well. Nothing special. It's one of my oldest videos. But we have seen how relatively light the Illyrian equipment really was. It was a lot of course, for the elite, heavy equipment, especially from the Hellenic world, because it was sort of the closer, and before the Roman conquest, somehow sort of the finest available, but there was surely some important Celtic or Thracian influence as well. But again, that's just the elite, right? And that's not like Illyrians. No one else other than the Greeks, by the way, ever had hoplitic phalanxes of any kind, right? So you see, that's the divide. It's just like when we see the same with I don't know, Massalia in southern Gaul, and realizing that the Hellenic influences also in warfare did not stretch outside the sort of district of the polis, right? The Gauls living close to Massalia fought in the same identical way. They would fight, hundreds of kilometers away from it. So do not make that. Actually, I will say, childish assumption that I don't know. Guys who fought on the high grounds were habituated to tougher infantries like the phalanxes, because I read somewhere that the Helvetii had that, and no, they fought all in the same way, right? And the quality of their infantries did not. First of all, again, the phalanx, I will not spend myself for this after all the lessons I made on the topic. But it has nothing to do with, again, any other people but the Greeks, because there is a specific political and social foundation to that. The Greeks themselves called phalanx every single type of heavy infantry they encountered, which means that, of course, it has nothing to do with their own, and that's just how we called them, by the way. The ways they fought, in fact, were substantially different. So for peoples, of course, that pop culture has not even suspected of having ever used the phalanx, right? But there are some misinterpretations, especially the internet chews everything. It's terrifying. I don't know how I uploaded 2,000 videos on YouTube, sleeping at night, perfectly well telling the truth, about my content possibly being twisted in every single possible way. And I don't remember even how I was ending the phrase, but to make a long story short, no, the Illyrians didn't have any phalanx. They had their own normal, absolute. You see, the Greeks were the exception to the rule. Essentially, also the Romans had pretty much the same formula in terms of, spearmen / swordmen, depending on the period, being identical pretty much everywhere. Also, this is true also for North Africa, for the Levant. Like, all sedentaries fought essentially in that way at this point in history. Now, aside from this, there is this correlate of other negative performance of the Illyrians. Right, we have to be careful with this, because again, also the redeeming part is arriving in the end. Right, the idea was that the Illyrians could and would panic easily. Right, and you have to interpret where this comes from. Of course, if you have a military system that is overwhelmingly superior by those times standards to yours, the idea of giving ground and resorting to skirmishes, to ambushes, to guerrilla, etc. is perfectly normal. We've seen it for the Celtiberians, for example. The same Scipio saying, well, these guys are great warriors individually, but as armies in open ground, they suck. And there is an anecdote from the time Alexander the Great's troops were in Illyria, at the very beginning of our timeline here, when these Macedons essentially bemused the Illyrians with their elaborate drill maneuvers, like the Macedonians had developed for reasons of statehood and just, the general level of training that the Greeks had historically achieved, and that by suddenly switching to the attack, managed to simply melt away the Illyrians, who fled their hill position, from which they were, as we'll see now, also most typically deploy, without even attempting to fight, which to some extent may have been actually a wise decision, right? Because fighting against Alexander's phalangites is maybe some experience you would not like to have in your, especially if you want to have a long existence. But of course, the Illyrians were not no cowards in the sense they would take on the enemy. Just Alexander had introduced, like with to his father, of course, as well, a very important step in the art of war, combined armed tactics, at least for Europe, with the hammer/cavalry and the anvil/phalanx. Never make the mistake of thinking that Macedonian tactics were an evolution of the Hoplitic ones, right? The Macedonian phalangites are conceived for operating in combined arms tactics, which the Hellenic classical phalanx did not have even the hope of, right? And it's a completely Macedonian thing. It has nothing to do with the Greeks in a narrow sense, right? But even less in this sense, it has to do with the poor Illyrian array that said, look, yes, we tried, but it was a joke. They escaped in front of even just here we're said that the Macedonian troops that were literally showing off their level of collective training in front of the Illyrians. So like that's the point. This is also an anecdote, though, simply like an army can withdraw at some point. We're watching them from the hills, naturally just by this declaring that they were on the defensive because they thought to be the inferior party, and they moved for whichever other strategical political reason away of that. Alexander would have not had really any problem in taking over, say, the entire Balkans, the Italian peninsula, even if he had ever wanted to go that way at this point in history, because in terms of political cohesion and also in terms of military instruments that could be opposed, the Romans were just toying with the manipular system at this point. In any case, it seems that the Illyrians wouldn't keep, in general, this is like from other sources, proper security when they camped. This was quite relevant because, as you know, the more advanced civilizations, the Greeks, the Romans, were quite much about the idea of, the camp is crucial, it must be protected, just as a general tactical, moral, and logistical precaution. Apparently, instead, the Illyrians had still a more primitive system. They wouldn't use sentries, ditches, palisades, thus they could have been easily surprised. Naturally, this is a stereotype, right? It's unlikely that the Illyrians didn't have some sort of garrisons watching, during the night, or ditches or palisades. They would have them, right? But by the Greco-Roman standards and the general stereotype of the barbarian, of course, they would appear much less developed in that direction. You see, a paranoid person would say, "Oh no, you see, this is the classical serf that is lying to you because it's all propaganda. That's not how my people was." No, right? They are actually pretty sound judgments, because we know effectively what the Illyrian military performance really was, and there wouldn't be anything strange to know that in fact they didn't have the same level of discipline that the Greeks and especially the Romans had when it came to camps in terms of general engineering, structural capacities, the general needs for which they would need that logistically. Like the Illyrian armies wouldn't even need that by a certain extent, because also strategically they were less performing, and just they wouldn't employ their own resources in that way. They had more effective ways to do so in order to try to fill like in relative terms, in order to fill those gaps that their limits were just presenting themselves with, right? But it's obvious that this is not the whole story. I mean, Illyria, as we were saying before, was pretty big, so there were areas that were more developed, others that were more primitive. We are, for example, told of the Dardanoi, that was one of the Illyrian tribes in 200 BC, being much steadier warriors, right? A source says these troops do not leave their ranks impulsively, but keep close order both in combat and withdrawal, right? This is something you do find in classical ethnography. When these nations are described, you see, look, they said these tribes are a bit like this other in that other way. It's a bit like you find it even among the Germans. The Romans said, oh look, this tribe works like us, right? They have the same drill or something comparable by scale at least. They make camp, right? So the Dardanoi that will recur here apparently in 200 BC were said to be like at least an exception by Illyrian standards, because they do not leave their ranks like this stereotype of the norm of the Illyrians that do not hold ground in the first place, but they do maintain essentially the order of their formation, essentially the integrity of the battle line, both in combat and when they withdraw from the field. This is relevant because, and I made a video about this explaining the origins of, say, tactics, at least tactica, as the Greeks would define it, as the properly a battle order. Among the Italics, among the Italians, the Romans, the Etruscans, and also why these peoples actually never really had any hoplitic tactics in any way, contrary to what some people still inexplicably believe. And I discuss, of course, the reason why they actually can be explained historiographically, but that's another video. Inasmuch as essentially it's only in the first millennium BC that different people start knowing properly the importance of a uniformly drilled, thickly compact battle line going in combat, like, well, in fact, aligned, cohesive, and maintaining that that order during the march, the fight, etc. Right? It's something that had been born, like from the Bronze Age, when chariotry dominated. Infantries had gotten tougher, had brought effectively to a decline of chariot warfare. I have a pretty wide Bronze Age, and also sort of in between Bronze and Iron Age, because that's the interesting part of the story, where also cavalry proper appears next to chariotry, like this order, right? And it's likely that the Illyrians, still as late as this, had an imperfect and sort of lesser potential to actually go into battle with consistent battle lines, and not essentially some clans put together on something that had to look like a battle line and that had troubles even moving around on the field, right? So these Dardanoi here are capable of maintaining the battle formation in combat, and the various, as you know, engagements that fundamentally followed from between a battle line and another for a few minutes, then distancing, then skirmishing for most of the time, and then coming close again. And also during the withdrawal, which is not to be given for granted, especially from a political point of view, because again, the Illyrians were not particularly cohesive, and so if the battle goes wrong, or rather than orderly withdrawing, you can think, okay, let's just go home wherever we leave, maybe hundreds of kilometers from there, and who cares about these guys locally? But of course, also some Illyrian tribes had forces in the thousands, in the tens of thousands. So there was surely a need, and also by imitation with the other Mediterranean peoples, like of maintaining this order, procuring it, like in some ways or another, because without that you couldn't quite hope, in fact, to hold your ground, not just in battle, but internationally, right? And of course, the Illyrians were sensitive to this because they realized their limits as other peoples. Imagine living, in fact, at the outskirts of powers like Macedon or Rome, right? Having Alexander on your doorsteps, right? That's metaphysical experience. It shakes you, right? It makes you realize you have to cope with someone that knows how to make war simply at another level compared to the one that you can by those times. It's also a relative novelty, and that's why, as we will see now, that there is likely in fact, an Illyrian growth in this capacity. Not much of a tactical, particularly sophisticated tactical development, but still the fundamental ability of achieving that political and thus military cohesion to maintain, to stand your ground in orderly battle lines in open field, right? That's how the thing did pass, because otherwise these populations, especially in the interland, were on broken terrains, forests, etc., mostly just motivated to use disorderly skirmishing rather than close combat on a more regular basis. We've seen this, again, pretty much everywhere. That's how, the more primitive Samnites more tendentially were compared, say, to the early manipular Romans, all right? They all could actually, and would go at war with heavy infantry descending from the mountains and facing the enemy in open field, but the likelihood or the possibility or the chance of doing it was different from the ones of more advanced peoples that made war on a larger scale. In the 5th century, Thucydides tells us that as the Illyrians fight in no sort of order, they have no sense of shame about giving up a position under pressure. To run forwards and to run backwards are equally honorable in their eyes. Every man is fighting on his own. It's a very interesting idea, considered that Thucydides was fixated with the idea of absolute discipline, right? He is a bit like the ultimate Hellenic idealist when it comes to the possibility of, in fact, divinely transcend any human limit, and saying if you just obey purely without any fear of anything else, you can defeat anyone. And so this could be applied to combat formations as well. Except our reality is different. Humanity is fallen, and for how much the Greeks were advanced, of course, they were also just humans themselves. The Romans, for example, never conceived Thucydides' possibility. That was also just it was a bit of an extreme one, right, at the peak of the Peloponnesian War, of the politic tactics, and from the very Hellenic motherland, right, as a perspective. But they always thought that virtus was required next to discipline. That is to say, there is always a bit of warrior in every soldier, necessary in order to make the latter functional in the first place. And I think the Roman legionary is the best example of this. It's the most fanatically trained soldier at a collective level, but if you look at his equipment and his just combat mode, he's fully able to fight individually, even individualistically, and this blend is fundamentally what makes the real deal, right? When you're able to combine it perfectly due to the right political and social availabilities, you are able, in fact, to take over the world. What the barbarians have is a lot of virtus, but a few discipline, and so that's schematically more or less the meaning of that. And the reason I stress this about Thucydides is that, of course, the judgment about the Illyrians here is pretty hard. Like, the idea is that they have no sense of shame, which would have existed evidently in the mind of a Greek, and that we know, of course, existed also in the Illyrian world. But this is similar to what we have seen, for example, for the Celtic barbarians, that we're told by classical sources were that in the same terms, actually, wouldn't consider it a shame to withdraw, and they would even just habitually carry out this hit-and-run tactic by routinely, in fact, withdrawing from the field, entrenching in some fortified hilltop, and then descending again, but from places that were also quite inhospitable and inaccessible. It's something we see as late as the Middle Ages in the Celtic fringe. It's really obvious and normal considering the relative political and social, hence military levels of development. And so here Thucydides is being a bit like, haha, these guys can't fight, haha, no, well, they have no shame, whatever. But telling the truth, right, Thucydides would have not been happy outside of the phalanx in some, Illyrian valley to withstand the assault of sort of more comfortably located Illyrian forces, right? We're told, again, this running forwards and backwards, that surely was part, in fact, of a rationalized, like properly a willing Illyrian fighting style, in presumably not just from a tactical point of view, but also strategically. The most interesting note is the last, perhaps, every man is fighting on his own, which, again, is said by one of the most prominent classical sources, say, making it a pride to be a Greek fighting in a phalanx. As a citizen soldier, with that civic esprit de corps and political identity, means, as we were saying before, really a lot. But the idea is congruent with, of course, the one of individualism of the warrior that doesn't quite fight much for a broader, let's say, interest for the fate of the others, but rather his own confidence, his own faith in his individual accomplishment, in fact. And so also the transfigurationally possible one that this would have for his kin, his people, but still reasoning from that basis, because he doesn't have the means to share, like, with a more effectively collective dimension through a training and discipline conferred by a higher, more concentrated authority like the one of the state can do, right? So this is, of course, really relevant to point out, right? So the idea is that the Illyrians would not press home and attack against the enemy, who stood firm, and would retire speed from vigorous charges, so literally giving ground, and thus acting as light infantry, like a peltast would do. Because mostly, and this is also a stereotype, of course, the Illyrians would be properly chosen to fight like that, at least in a Greek context, among heavies and heavier troops. The Illyrian mercenaries would have been mostly actual skirmishers, right? And there would be instances in which, in fact, whenever, say, bulkier armies would approach, like the Illyrians would give way and harass the enemy, luring in on broken ground, sort of a less strategically relevant one, because of course the most important are the valleys, the flatland. But that was also more challenging for the larger armies to even reach in the first place. But of course, if the Illyrians had enough manpower to, say, crush one of these armies just by strength ratio, they would coalesce, they would descend from this ground, and they would meet the enemy in hand-to-hand combat and overwhelm it. Right? They had, again, their own heavy infantry. They knew how to fight as such. It seems that the regular Illyrian approach to an enemy battle line was missile hurling and fierce war crying, right? So this was also, again, typical in general. All peoples, aside from the Greeks, perhaps, in as much as they wouldn't, at least they would skirmish in a more detached way from the phalanx, but overall everybody softened up the enemy lines with javelins. Like, at least they would do it against the respective light infantries while screening essentially the heavies while they were deploying in battle line. This was pretty normal. But it seems again that the Illyrian was more conceived like, in fact, the average warrior of the non-civilized world, with just a sword, a dagger, let's say, better, a couple of javelins / spears, and pretty much it, right? Hardly any heavier equipment at all, right? And that's why such forces would behave like this tactically on the field. The episode of Alexander's army against the Illyrians dates to 335, and it seems here that again, after Thucydides in the century before, the Illyrians had still, say, no shame, according to the classical source, about abandoning positions in the face of such a better, say, more determined enemy. At the end of the day, we don't have to think even Alexander's forces having been unassailable because of the phalanx, but because they were better soldiers, they were morally superior, right? They had a level of confidence that the Illyrians just in that circumstance wouldn't have. That's really the thing, because otherwise, like, the Illyrians would charge a phalanx, and they did. There are examples of this in different battles, and that's how any other people would attack a phalanx, as a matter of fact. I made a pretty lengthy video explaining the vexata quaestio of the Manipular Legion versus Macedonian phalanx, and say it's not in order to defeat a phalanx, like, you would hopefully want to outflank it in some way, but otherwise the regular way any battle line, every heavy infantry, phalanx or not, would go against one another is frontally and into hand-to-hand combat, which did happen, right? And there weren't really tricks to break it otherwise. Like, there is this mythology that the Romans defeated the Greeks because they sent troops in between the gaps of the phalanx between the pike. That's not how it happened, right? If you're just misguided about what happened at the Battle of Pydna, that was actually the phalanx battle line to break into several points because of terrain, and the Romans exploiting that, but likely not even that being the single most important factor that decided the engagement between the two formations. And of course, the Illyrians would at some point charge into the enemy Saricides at some point, just like any other, right? And it would hurt, right? Of course, the Macedonian phalanx was never broken by an Illyrian frontal assault, and that I'm aware of practically of nobody else's. So things do work in at least in frontally, that's the point. If everything goes well with the rest of the formation, it's not just by having a phalanx that automatically spares you from defeat, as we know, but not also for the usual reasons why one may think, like the front could not break by itself, for example. If you didn't maintain a formation, that was still a precaution that every army had to maintain with some intense level of training. Like much of warfare is throughout history about this, by the way. We see Illyrian speed in all this, which we've seen it with the Romans. It's been at the siege of Scodra. There, like the idea, let's attack, let's hope, even if it's not explicitated by the source, but let's hope to break the Romans. At that point, they failed because they wouldn't, and they couldn't sustain a prolonged fight after having failed at that. This is typical of, say, barbarian tactics. Like this is told typically about the Celts. They were all about the first charge, and then they would break if they didn't break the enemy in turn. Of course, this is also very simplistic as an idea. There were prolonged engagements. The Celts had their own cohesion. They could go back and forth, right? But overall, like we're talking a scale of warfare and a quality of training in the art of war that had, for most of these peoples, not yet materialized. There is evidence in 200 BC that the speed of the Illyrians would be effective in quick dashes and sudden charges, right? So these Illyrians we're talking about are actually tralles in Macedonian service, so at least these are expected to charge. And this again proves what we're saying, that there were like the tralles were a bit more of an Eastern Illyrian tribe, but in general, like so there were different fighting styles that could have been influenced, but especially by the East. But let's not exaggerate. Again, all these troops could charge at some point. And we have to think about them again, not even so, say, kept in an anti-melee function, right? Because also among each other, they would, of course, fight extensively into hand-to-hand combat, right? The idea is rather about, again, the cohesion of the formation and whether it can be held. Of course, as we've seen in the video about Illyrian helmets and armor, the general outlook is pretty light. All right, there isn't that sense that just the Illyrian equipment is very anatomic, is very light. It doesn't have great elaborate designs. It's practical, it's functional. It's also cheaper. Like at least the type of warrior we see most of the times is sort of more likely equipped. Also the elite one. So just these guys were poorer than other peoples in the first place. But again, it's all these factors that compenetrate each other to give that particular elasticity, particular speed of the Illyrians that in some cases could be used for charging faster, right? This was the main challenge as well. I mean, if you charge, you lose cohesion more quickly. So as we'll see now, there were some cases in which say a mass charge in its speed could be more important than order. We've seen it even among the hoplites at Leuctra, like the Thebans. Like, in many ways, like it's been overly emphasized in a way, but in the divide with the Spartans. But the idea was that, do not even give them the time to maneuver. Right? Be faster just with the sheer mass of the charge. It's not literally what happened as it's normally said for Leuctra, but it could be true in many ways. I mean, the time of deployment was crucial for all these peoples. That's why, for example, the Illyrians normally chose those hill positions because they wanted to avoid the enemy to simply rush at them easily, so that they would have time to prepare, to align, to form some kind of suitable defense, which apparently they were sort of more in difficulty to do in open field, right? In 233 BC, we find 5,000 Illyrians charging without too many problems a larger Aetolian army. So this was actually the entire levy of the Aetolian League, which is impressive. Essentially, the Illyrians left behind their own light infantry, which was also a way to, let's say, probably acting more unconventionally to surprise the enemy, because otherwise skirmishing would have been still, important in the initial phases. Light infantry was specifically left holding hilltops, and the rest of the Illyrian forces followed up with a fast downhill charge, which essentially managed to overwhelm and sweep away the entire Aetolian contingent. Cavalry, infantry. This is particularly interesting because it shows you how a robust contingent of 5,000 Illyrians could carry out just by sheer will to power, favored by terrain to some extent, but also finding actually not otherwise a condition of severe inferiority against, say, relevant enemy troops. The Aetolians were not, say, the heaviest of the Greeks by degree, but still, like, they were, compared to the Illyrians, and there is like a remarkable performance here of a speed downhill Illyrian force charge, which shows you what, in fact, these people could do when they were led by the right leaders. They were in the right moral status, let's say, and had evidently other qualities that here, unfortunately, we can't know in detail, but that surely, like, that's what masses can do. That's the proof of what we were saying before, that for how significant differences in classical work can seem to us, still they were incredibly lower than today's. Normally, like, the asymmetry, military speaking, was much lower, and so even if Illyria could not produce the best armies around, still they could pull off these feats. The Dardanoi in 200 BC were praised, as we were remembering before, essentially because of their good order, their willingness to hold firm and to fight to melee, right? And there is a proof, also in importantly early time, such as 358 BC, when the Dardanian king Bardulus, which was likely the founder of the same Dardania, politically speaking, formed square with his men, when outflanked by a Macedonian army with more cavalry. Now this is interesting because the square in many ways is a universal anti-cavalry formation that, however, requires an important degree of cohesion, collective training, like minimal knowledge of what you have to do before performing that maneuver. We also don't have particular information about what this Illyrian square looked like. It's also very early time, so information gets degraded over time. In general, however, we observed that, say, different forces could have simply gathered, compacted, like having, say, maybe not a perfect square geometrically, but something like a round formation of sort, right? People watching each other's back as a broader circle, or again a square, more or less. We have to assume this was actually an orderly formation of some sort, so who knows. In any case, the Illyrians are eventually beaten. In this encounter, not after a tough resistance. So that's also something that happens for times not particularly developed peoples, but fighting to the death is surely what these warriors can show. Like, not regularly. It takes a lot of courage and capacity, but if you are objectively surrounded, you can't get out of there, and the alternative is actually and readily like worse than the situation you find yourself in. Really, you're not going to test that possibility. The valor of the Illyrians, however, is pointed out. This capacity of simply, see, it's a desperate maneuver in many ways. It's something we have seen. I think we haven't made a video about the Battle of Magnesia, but we talked about that in one of those videos. In fact, about the phalanx. On that occasion, the immense Seleucid army against the Romans, having lost the wings temporarily, like so the phalanx proper, but they had elephants. They actually formed square, and eventually just to be shattered apparently by the same elephants from within the same. That's a desperate maneuver. They were waiting for cavalry to be essentially to come back, because one of the wings was still intact. But the sense here is, of course, more practical. Like it's mostly what fascinates is the new of the square per se, not much the fact that they gathered to fight to the death, right? Which is something again you find in many circumstances. This part of the line is overwhelmed in the battle. This is not important again, but there is general reflection that has been made scholarly on the contrast between the 5th century Illyrians fighting apparently without order, individually, right? Naturally by approximation, and the Sparai that they formed together with the Macedonian phalanx at the Battle of Sellasia, right? And so there's been a debate regarding the improvement in Illyrian organization and the possibility of even some new tactical notion introduced from Macedon at this point. The thing went as far as postulating that, for example, the effectiveness of the 3rd century Illyrian raids in other contexts would have been connected with this. In my opinion, the matter is much simpler, much more banal, right? Illyrian warfare did not change that much, right? What we see is actually something pretty normal that we witnessed also at, for example, at the Battle of Ausklum in the Epirot army of Pyrrhus, when in fact some Sparai of, for example, of Oscan mercenaries were interspersed in the ones of the phalanx because of the tough terrain. There was a stream, it was a sort of a broken ground of sort, and so this is completely normal for many reasons. In the case of Pyrrhus, we've seen it. First of all, the phalangitic forces had been depleted numerically during the Italian campaign. They needed to hold the line with something, and even in that case, for the Epirot army was said, oh my god, Pyrrhus was experimenting new tactics or whatever. That is something relatively new, but at the same time we tend to again overstate the sort of the nature of the let's say, of the tactical differentiation in heavy infantry. All right, the effectiveness of the phalanx was not merely a matter of, how troops technically fought on the battlefield. It's more like it has to do with the general, again, morale behind them, the training they were given, the sort of spirit that they incarnated as those type of soldiers that only secondarily fought, again, as phalangites specifically, out of reasons that now we can't simply digress on. But if you needed to hold the line with heavy infantry, as it was really normal in the sedentary world, everybody fought pretty much in the same way, you would all obviously be able to flank like a unit of phalangites together to a unit of, say, this other barbarian allies. What's strange about that? What kind of tactics, should entail? I mean, why would the Illyrians fighting at Silesia interspersed within the phalanx have intrinsically some greater training or a different way of war, or some alterated capacity, fighting capacity, compared to the one that an Illyrian could simply have? And not fighting, for example, just in their natural way, right? It's not that we see, I don't know, the Olskans of Pyrrhus or the Illyrians of Antigonus the third dozen at Silesia, like having upgraded their own way of war to a degree that, oh my god, they're just literally like a unit, like it existed in all these battle lines, and like how they were segmented in smaller subunits. Also the phalanx, it wasn't like something with I will not even address the nonsense of people thinking that the normal space that exists in every battle line between the subunits is some sort of tactical disadvantage whatsoever. No, it was not exploited, right? People grossly mistake because they have no idea of how battles were actually fought. Like entire lines breaking into different chunks from like how normally subunits were spaced between the battle line was fundamentally homogeneous. Even if we are not precisely informed about the gaps, they weren't such to be tactically exploited. I mean, getting yourself into them wouldn't actually favor you, because either you just found yourself symmetrically in between enemy units, if there was enough space for your own to still fight functionally. Otherwise, you had to squeeze yourself, breaking your own formation. That didn't make any freaking sense, right? Unless you have like literally an entire phalanx broken, like at the Battle of Chaironeia or at Pydna, you can't get with another unit like on the rear of one of the chunks and breaking it. Like that's another thing. Like the spaces have nothing to do with that. So also creating again a battle line with multiple types of units, or even interspersing them to make them more homogeneous, so that one chunk of the line, say the one composed just by Illyrians, wouldn't give way more easily. In fact, to allow this actually makes the point I was making, like to allow the enemy to actually outflank you there. And just one Speyrite, that is the equivalent of a company of some sort. It's the same term that the Greeks use for the Roman maniple, right? So again, and for any genius out there, no, this doesn't mean that the Illyrians were using Roman maniples, right? Speyrite is just like, as we were saying before, phalanx. It's a Greek term that the Greeks used to define a unit of a specific size in specific contexts, and it has nothing to do with the specificities or the technicalities of the people's tactics that employed them. All right. So what happened at Silesia is, again, completely normal. It could have been the Illyrians as any other people, right? We have seen the Olskans of Pyrrhus. So if we look at the evolution of the art of war, which surely had been going on throughout this time, there were some changes within, like, at least the use of sperae of different ethnic forces other than the Macedonian one in the phalanx is debatably part of this, but the essentials of Macedonian tactics remain the same. Whether these people like the Illyrians would have, particularly ingrained any tactical lesson from their service as mercenaries in Hellenistic armies, well, sure, but again, this wouldn't change their fundamentals at home. It's just like the Oscans, right? They fought with Pyrrhus for a long time, at least in that generation, but they could have acquired that knowledge about how a phalanx worked, but could they replicate that at home? No. Did they need that? No, neither, right? The same goes for the Illyrians. So I think that sometimes people go too far because they want to say, oh my god, something was changing. There was a revolution behind that, new tactical reforms, new ideas. No, right? There is no evidence of that. And again, there is a bit of I don't know. I would like to come back at some point on the debate about the phalanx, because I'm actually a great supporter of the phalanx. Yes, I love the Romans better than the Macedons, but I always made the latter's sort of side of the story my own as well, because I was very impressed in general by, like, I studied Hellenistic warfare for a long time, and I was legitimately fascinated with them, and I came to a point in my life that was fortunately already a long time ago, which I think, let's say, my objectivity was satisfactory in, say, terms of historical analysis, and I would love to point out, say, not much, of course, what were the advantages, the disadvantages of the Macedonian system, but more importantly, why it came to develop the way it was, and what was the world doing, say, in these generations in general, to think where also the military debate, like the same tactical development, aside from that, of course, was actually going. And there is not much room for thinking that there was much of another system on the horizon, except the Roman one that, in fact, in some ways was also not just by imitation of the Romans, telling the truth, as the other side wants you to make believe, but was pretty much the norm, like the idea of what we call, look at these peoples also, I don't know, the Ptolemies and the Seleucids got the legionnaires, so they were copying the Romans, whatever. It's not that Rome wasn't influent enough to, of course, spark interest in that sense and trying to have something similar, but it was the precondition, like the same one that had brought the phalanx to exist for centuries in the first place, and it was still there for those countries in which at least the state worked well enough to have one, which is, in fact, most of what the discriminant is about. So it's really like a topic one has to address with the proper, say, tools, not just pretending that, look, I found this term in this text. That's how I think. I have so many history from my previous Facebook group's experience for years now. I don't do that anymore, but before Schwerpunkt, and of all the kind of you see, I'm fascinated, I think, legitimately as a historian, mostly with people's psychology towards history, like how people approach history in their brains, rather than, let's say, in order to explain what actually happened for real better, it's complementary in this regard. But sometimes I'm really fascinated with the limits of human mind, and of course in hoping to surpass them. And so that's why I need to make this point, because I don't like to make sensationalistic history, like this is what those simplified history channels, as they call themselves now, would throw around like, oh, something was changing deeply because maybe they read it from some book, from some scholar or whatever, and they think that, oh my god, this guy said that, so I can repeat that. No, right? And that's also one of the reasons why you know that my content is original, because actually it's largely, so you can say, against say what people would call the mainstream. Actually, at this point in history we have pretty good historiography when it comes to certain specific aspects, but at least something that you can find from the mass, right? But on the most because military history has some sort of interests of its own, but I will not digress on this now. I do things like using my now decades old, not 2 decades, in a serious way, even though I have, since childhood, a lot of sort of different insight to warfare, but say decades long, the second decade, military historical experience at least academic level. So let's say that I noticed this over time. It's something that at the beginning you assume, you interiorize, and if you get the fundamentals right, eventually you are able just to apply this by exercise, right, with the right precautions of objectivity, because analogy is not always the so you can't simply copy one thing and export it into another. In fact, the basic as an acceptable level that I was just criticizing before, like looking at the Speyrai, look at these guys in the phalanx, so who knows what was happening in Illyria, they could have their own phalanx. No, right? And also for other reasons, by the way, because coming back to the point, the Illyrians were short of cavalry, and in part apparently of tactical specialization, even among the infantry. I mean, they would operate, as we've seen, as light infantry quite often, but they did not have apparently much of a differentiated say type of soldier when it came to the average meeting ground between the heavy infantryman and the skirmisher, because they were sort of a bit both of the same thing. Again, this is just like, again, the Celtiberians, very similar people in many ways, except Celtiberians had very good cavalry, and they were fighting very different heartland than the Balkan one. So it's interesting. These are you see, you can have interesting military developments depending on factors that are not so much related to the proximity of specific military cultures, right? But we're not here specifically to compare that. We mostly can compare things when they are actively engaged against one another, right? But especially because they're so similar, even though that's the point, like you can't compare them to highlight how really similar these peoples really were. And by the way, the cavalry shortage would make the Illyrians significantly vulnerable to harassing and outflanking attacks by also probably the skirmishers, or by the light infantrymen. The idea is that the Illyrians went at war like a sort of single bulk, right, of essentially heavy infantry that could melt away in, as we've seen more often than not, against a particularly superior opponent, with some, again, spurts of significant power, determination that could even wipe out remarkably superior enemies, but rarely, like actually just once, as we've seen for the Aetolians. we've seen how the Macedons outflanked the Illyrians. At some point, there were in terms of art of war development less than what was happening in the more advanced civilizations. This is also the reason why they typically made it a habit to seize commanding hills, often wooded ones, by the way, also because the ferocious Balkan hinterland allowed them to do so, especially, in fact, in defense, as you understand, giving some security against enemy attacks in general. Like, of course, Illyrian warfare was primarily designed to cope against other Illyrians for the conditions they had in that country, but of course this would generally work also for other, let's say, enemy attacks. If you want to dislodge these guys from a forest, you have to send light infantry, or at least infantry that is pretty good in those terrains as well, and so that would use similar tactics after all. And so that's way, again, being in the woods to be more protected, also especially from cavalry attacks, etc. This would protect their flanks. The same goes for the type of paths they would follow, right? The line of march had to be protected, and of course the Illyrians knew the Illyrian terrain better than anyone else. They would exploit the forested mountains in their own territory, which in a sense sheltered them for centuries, meaning that before they were firmly conquered by someone, that is the Romans, it would take during antiquity some time, right? Gradual, as difficult conquest of all these various hill forts scattered in the Balkan hinterland. Think about the Dinaric Alps passes and how insidious this were. So again, not places that could pose a significant threat as a bull, like invading force or whatever, capable of facing the ones of the greatest powers of the time, but surely one that would make it very difficult to simply enter Illyria and starting to rule over it, because certain places were properly inaccessible unless you carried out major, say, not even major operations, but capillary ones that had to be repeated until these guys were dislodged from their nests, they were hunted down, they were massacred, they were deported, something like that. In continuing through, of course, their own vicious guerrilla, and to create problems just out of retaliation, and how you can imagine this civilizational clashes normally going, right? So the same goes for their, again, hilltops that were dotted with fortified towns. And sources say that the Illyrians were given confidence by the nature of their country and by their fortifications, some of which were also, like, to be reckoned with, like, in general, especially on the Mediterranean, where the majority of the wealth was concentrated. In relative terms, you would have sort of a greater surplus that could be employed for fortifying certain centers that were at some point even, I don't know, colonized by other peoples, and the Illyrians maybe coming back and exploiting the local infrastructure and being also blended with, mostly with the Greeks and the Hellenic colonies. So this is essentially the picture, the landscape. Then we will talk at some point also about the proper Illyrian army organization, looking a bit also better at the size of the Illyrian forces. There were not so many, like overall they fought within their country. In that case, they could be even in the tens of thousands. Like if there was probably a major coalition at a regional level, otherwise they were contingents, as we've seen, of hundreds, thousands, at most. Like it would be typical, some hundreds or few thousands, like that's the range. And you encountered them in many battles. The Macedons naturally hired them as mercenaries because they were close at hand. They were good to, like also on the broken terrain of Greece, to make say some impression. And at the Battle of Kynoskephali, for example, the Romans had to fight against such sort of mixed forces. Actually, they weren't just Illyrians, but just for saying that the Macedons used these forces to operate in that case on the Kynoskephali ridge that was mountainous and forested. So what better troops than the Illyrians and some Turiophorus from some allied city or something like that. Like that's how you eventually use these forces, right? You pick the right terrain, because the phalanx can't get there, but through only specific paths and with great care for maintaining the formation. So it's the phalanx was actually much more flexible than we tend to think, but of course it did have its limits, and that battle actually shows it. So as you understand, even as a medievalist, I'm not shy to talk, but especially I will simply not shut up about ancient warfare. I don't have blank paper, better blank audio track in this case, crisis. Just give me a microphone and a recording software. I will start talking for hours about these things. But I really like it because especially ancient history is so didactic, right, in ways that we tend to underestimate. And so don't exchange ancient history just for a meme, like the video gaming culture that stemmed from, even as you know, I was a total war modder myself, but it's like, in fact, reality is much better, right? It's really something that we tend to overlook dramatically. We chase this sort of simulation, sort of, oh my god, we will be able to make it real, whatever. It's just like that. No, it's not like that. There's something fundamentally different about reality that you cannot grasp, and until you study history proper, right? And I give you that sometimes in video gaming, say AI, the general say attitude to these topics creates that sense of hype and entertainment that we, again, I understand myself, like it's not a, though I don't have time to play video games, to mod them, whatever, anymore for quite a while, but I'm sensitive to the issues that emerge when talking about these topics, and sort of say having to explain them in a way that can help others to approach this history in life and politics and culture in sort of more effective ways, I think. Well, we will hopefully talk more soon about the Illyrians. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise,